I felt it was like a poem that could be debated endlessly and never sort of like it fudges around issues, and it sort of has all these sort of grey areas of very poetic language. One possible explanation, a theory that became quite prominent, and I actually think could be some credence to it of why that could be quite a rational explanation for that, is that the author himself, this alleged John, wrote it about the Roman Empire that he was living in during the time. And that if he'd written it about the Roman authorities during those times, it could quite plausibly be that he didn't want them to know that he was writing it about them at the time, because he was quite critical of them, perhaps, describing them in pretty appalling fashion at times. Pretty demonic fashion sometimes that he would describe them in. So he would probably want to distance himself from who he was talking about, considering if he was writing about the Roman Empire during his lifetime. That would be a good reason for using coded and obscure language in order to not have his criticisms of the Romans known during those times. And this theory makes some sense, because if he was publishing insightful publications, he might very well be in some danger if he was publishing and distributing that sort of material. If it was telling people inflammatory information about Roman authorities, it could even be inspiring sort of protests or movements, or of various kinds like that. Thus, he might well have a good motive there for disguising the targets of his criticisms at the time and using that poetic and sometimes flamboyant language. There are many others who think he was writing about his own age and not a future prophecy, therefore, and that those 7 hills that are described are in fact the Rome of his day. However, I would say most mainstream Christians would say that they tend to say that it's about future prophecies. They tend to think he was not talking about his own age, as I've come to consider as most likely. They tend to think that he's actually talking about some sort of future age. So what's the evidence for that? I guess that's the question I want to know. Why would people think that? Why? What's the reasoning? What's the proof behind that? How would we know that? Because that's quite a big kind of leap of faith, isn't it? It's a big sort of thing to sort of come to a conclusion of. And I think if you're going to sort of make, and I sort of was agnostic for many years. I thought maybe it could be keep an open mind. To an extent, I do keep an open mind because I don't know all the information. I never claim to be all knowing about things anyway. I make mistakes about things, but I think if there were many people that do claim to be all knowing in that, and many people claim it's just a load of old gibberish, and they sort of, or they don't take the time to look into and sort of actually question it. Many other people claim that it's all literal and it's all true, but I kind of think, where's the evidence? What's the actual evidence that anything within that book prophesizes times to come, hundreds of years into the future? What great revelation of this age, of what to him would be a distant future age, is there? Many would say the talk of all the wars, rumours of wars, plagues, deaths, natural disasters, that they show an insight. Surely he could not have known such things long ago. In actual fact, if you look back at ancient records, all the historical records back in the day, those that still exist, in fact, the Romans documented some things, how much you accept of their records, they're not going to portray themselves in the worst light, perhaps, but in actual fact, you find accounts of epidemics at the time, of chronic illnesses that were prevalent during ancient times. You'll find, in fact, episodes of the plague that existed thousands of years ago, and all manner of different disabilities, blindness, leprosy, a whole wealth, sadly, of all different diseases and outbreaks and epidemics. You'll find not just in that part of the world, but depending on how much information you have, you find that in other cultures too. You also find, of course, that there were lots of wars that were happening at the time, whether they were internal conflicts within the Roman Empire or whether they were expansionist conflicts, like in various sort of colonies, of course, that they would have. So you found that there were lots of wars that took place then, and there were in other parts of the world. I don't think you'll find any historical records of any region of the world where there were not plagues and there were not wars, and there were not debts and people that are poor. Sadly, these are sort of terrible things that have been with us for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, actually, so if I make a prediction of something in the future, and those things are actually happening right now in the age that I'm living at, am I describing things in the future, or am I just describing what's going on now, actually? And is it the same things happening now as been happening thousands of years ago? Some people would say, however, that the extent to which it's happening has increased and it's grown, so that it's happening so much more now than has ever happened before. But how do you know that? What would you base that claim upon? We don't have absolutely accurate records from thousands of years ago, so we don't really know the true extent of how widespread pandemics or illnesses in general were, or how many people were killed by warfare at the time, or murder, or various other assaults or illnesses. So if you look at the case of Aboriginal culture, there were people that lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, perhaps even millenniums, in Americas, Australias, and other parts of the world. They didn't keep accurate records. Even in parts of Africa, we don't really know. We have a shortage of records. There's a poverty of records in some areas, in fact, where there is such a distinct lack of information. We just don't know how often, how regular the occurrences were at that time. But we certainly do know that those things did happen and happened fairly regularly to some extent. Even if you went a few hundred years back, a third of the population in Europe died at one point during the plague. I'd say that was pretty damn epidemic. It doesn't get much more serious than that, huh? But that also happened some thousands of years before that. So if we look back over many hundreds and thousands of years, yes, you see terrible natural disasters. You'll find accounts of volcanoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, of flooding, of famines, of diseases, of all sorts of disorders hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. The further you go back, there tends to be less records, and there tends to be less sort of evidence. Absence of evidence doesn't mean an evidence of absence. It just means we don't know, do we really? So it could be in Aboriginal cultures, for example, that those things could have been happening, but we don't know the scale of it. So there's limited sort of anecdotal evidence there. But certainly all these things have been occurring for thousands upon thousands of years anyway. So that would fit really into that theory that book was written about that time, because there were all those disasters happening then, to be honest. And yes, they're happening now, but are they happening to a greater extent now? Can you prove that? I'm not convinced that that's the case, actually. I'm not. I remain sort of agnostic, I suppose, about that. There's insufficient data to prove it, I suppose. No one has infallible records covering many millenniums. So how do we know how many of those incidents really occurred in the past? All we do know is that they were prevalent in some cultures at some points in the past. We don't have totally accurate records to know all the information, though. In fact, millenniums ago, the world seemed to be much less connected at some points. Today, the world seems to be a lot more connected. We've had globalization, this post-colonial world that we are in. So we're much more aware. Look at the coronavirus. We're more aware of outbreaks in China, in Italy. I'm hearing about reports that are happening in America, in Korea, as far away as Japan even. So, but in the past, if I was living in the Roman Empire, I'm not going to hear about what's going on in Africa or over in China so much. I'm not going to hear. I don't have television. I don't have information being shared through the internet. I have books at that point. So it's a different kind of media. It's a different kind. So I don't think there's as much information to be shared. So I don't think there's as much awareness, perhaps. So that could be one reason. In an ever-globalizing world with increasing media, with increasing interconnected media, I've got people on Facebook from Europe, from America, from India, Africa, I used to have, who are sharing different stories of their lives and that. And, news sources are more connected from different parts of the world. And that's not to say whether they're any more true or false, of course. There's still that same old problem, but we're getting more information from different parts of the world. We don't have to sort of spend weeks or months or even years traveling or to waiting for travelers to come back with news from other places. It can be sent through text messages, through emails, through videos, through conference calls. It can be sent fairly automatically. So the exchange of information and the nature of that has changed through technology over the last years, in fact, and over the last decades and centuries. We're not relying on snail mail post and someone like traveling months from another empire to bring us an update anymore. We can get that sent through a post or link, Instagram, text, or through Facebook, or whatever the medium. But that has changed. So we are much more aware of situations and information is much more shared, whether that's right or wrong information. But in fact, millenniums ago, the world was less interconnected. We had no planes or computers, and fewer people were able to travel abroad. So people were much more regional about their issues that they knew about. In fact, until medieval age, many in Europe, Africa, and Asia didn't even know there was a continent called America. Many people doubted there was even such a place, or they had limited knowledge of whether there was such a place or not. So we didn't even. It's not that we didn't even get news from America. We didn't even know there was an America until a few hundred years ago, huh? So how are people thousands of years ago going to know about epidemics, wars, and other natural disasters going on in other parts of the world? It just seems like it wouldn't be. That person writing at that time and place couldn't therefore have had easy access to know what's going on in South Africa, in China, in the Americas, Australasia, and so on. So it seems kind of unlikely, that, doesn't it, when you stop and think about it, actually. There were some reasons why people might believe there are more incidents through increased globalization, through more technology, more access to different kinds of information, and of course through an increased population is the other point. If one believes, as the statistics say, that we now have over 7 billion people, that's a massive increase from the ancient world's population, which was really minute in comparison. Well, we're not really sure what the population figures, how do we know? But perhaps there could be more incidents today just because there are more people. More people, more life equals more death. Everybody's going to die, aren't they? So, if you have more people, you're going to have more good, more bad, more accidents, more incidents. That just stands to reason, isn't it? As the population increase, the murder rate will increase. That doesn't mean people are worse. It just means that there's a lot more people as well, doesn't it? So it could also be down to gigantic population increases. There's also another reason that people might perceive that there are more worse incidents going on in the world today. Because there's going to be more bad in the world, but there's more good, because if there's a lot more people, there's going to be more good and bad. It doesn't mean that people are necessarily more bad, though. More people just means more rubbish, doesn't it? But also more beauty. And so, that just seems a logical conclusion, doesn't it? If you accept that population increase has happened, as statistics report it, unless you kind of think that those statistics are made up. Then that's a different kind of conspiracy to get into, isn't it? But I don't, and I don't have any reason to think that, actually. In short, the sufferings described are things that were already occurring in the author's own world, in fact. There are no real things that were not happening already in his own day and age. We have yet, therefore, out of those things, to see it proven that any of those rates have actually increased. I haven't seen any clear categorical proof for that yet myself. And I haven't seen anyone arguing for that has demonstrated clearly any proof either yet. So, but I will happily change how I feel like if I should see that evidence. But there's been a complete poverty and shortage of that over the years, many years actually. There's been ample time for anyone to provide that, but nothing since. In fact, quite a lot of evidence to the contrary, actually. So what predictions are there that were not already happening? Something that could not have been known about during that author's lifetime. what things could there have been? What things, like, if I was looking for something in the future, if I wanted to send a message to someone hundreds of years ago to prove that it was true, genuine, what could I send them? Like something to know about their future that I could not have known about. Like you might choose something like television. You might choose trains, planes, computing. Something that people thousands of years ago couldn't really have imagined. Obviously, they'd have to use quite poetic language to try and describe that, wouldn't they? Like a car. A car could be described as a chariot of fire, perhaps, or something. You could still find ways, couldn't you? Um, but there's no such kind of language. There's nothing like that. There's no attempt to describe anything that modern day inventions. The fact that there is an America that exists, that might have been interesting to sort of reveal that, mightn't it? Because that would prove beyond any doubt to the future people, like, how did he know that this whole continent existed before anyone else did, But there's no kind of like, there's nothing about modern technology, is there? There's nothing about kind of the world wars. There's nothing about colonialism or slavery. All of those kind of gigantic episodes in history have really shaped the modern world. About the rise and fall of all the different empires that we've seen in Europe since then. The Mongolian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Doesn't mention anything about any of those things either, as well as the technological advances, satellites, houses in the sky. Could have gone into any of that. Nothing. So there's real kind of room for like going into like revealing things to the future, but there's absolutely nothing that I can see there. And so I mean, that it doesn't prove that other things are false in the book. It just doesn't prove that it's true, does it? Really? So there's no kind of no chariots of fire, nothing of that sort. The absolute proof and the burden of proof lies on those that are saying that this is absolutely true and you should live your life by it. They have got the burden to prove that that is true and that there's a good reason for thinking that. And I guess for me, knowing that there's something within that that's false already, the idolatry. So I suppose for me, knowing that at least one part of that is false, that therefore makes me suspect the other parts. And I haven't yet to see any of those other things proven in any way at all, actually. And so if you're claiming something is true and you have to live your life by it, the burden of proof is on you, and you've got to therefore provide those proofs. And I've seen a complete absence of that, in fact. There's been nothing, in fact. There's been lots of people making signs and saying things and repeating slogans, but that proves nothing. That's just sort of sloganeering at the end of the day. And it's just sort of like, I guess the idea behind that is just to keep repeating the same things ad nauseum to sort of wear people down. But that if anything, proves a complete lack of having any rational or emotional sort of reality to actually the debate. It shows an unwillingness to engage in any debate and just sort of repeating the same things ad nauseum without actually providing any realism or any real explanation to justify why they believe those things. To absolutely prove the book is prophetic, they could have easily alluded to any technological or cultural innovations that no human could reasonably have known at those times. And I have not seen anything like that whatsoever. Many early editions of what's called the Bible, but actually, there were various different collections of books going back at that point, but a large amount of those earliest collections didn't have any copy of the Revelations in them, actually. Only later ones that started showing that they had that included. But of course, this itself doesn't prove a book's validity nor disprove it either. But it does make you wonder, I suppose, at least, how it was that people in the earliest churches didn't have any copy of it, or at least some of them didn't, because there were other books circulating, or other collections of books, which had absolutely no copy of that one at all within it. So, of course, there's also the notion of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where we try to make something become true. And this itself could also be a reason that some see the book as prophetic. It's almost like where you're trying to act out something within a book. You're trying to imitate it, or trying to use something from a book to make it seem like it's real, by calling your name or creating company logos that appear similar to those things. So it's actually the other way around. You're using things within a book to sort of create things in life, for whatever reason, to make it appear that it's real to others. And I can see some evidence for that in life, actually, where people named their groups or areas after things in books, actually. There's certainly some evidence for that happening in life. And I myself might be wrong in many of my assertions. All of us as humans are capable of making mistakes, of course. Yet I have yet to see any absolute proof whatsoever for the book. In fact, I have seen evidence against it. The Nostradamus books, if you look at those, they're actually quite similar, in fact, actually, in how they talk about things in their vague and poetic type of language. They were considered revelations by many, actually. But these are also liberal interpretations of poetic and vague accounts, because his books contain a vast amount that could be interpreted at any time and place, and have been done by so many, actually. Of course, there is one thing that I can think of that the book maybe prophesies right, and that's that I'm here. Yet there are many other books that also make mention of the idea of reincarnation as well, actually. So lots of other books before that predate that made mention of reincarnation and of various other people returning to Earth. And lots of other books were already talking about that. And actually, if you look at other books, notions of the spirit of Elijah, and there are other brief references to those reincarnation accounts. So in actual fact, that's not something that's exclusive only to that book. You see a lot of other accounts of reincarnation, actually, in other books as well. But nevertheless, one correct prediction doesn't prove other things right in actual fact. So, like I said at the start, actually, one can get one thing right and other things wrong. People are often do, in fact. I'm not a holy lamb, and I don't know anyone else that is, actually. I've never met anyone that matches up to any kind of pantomime like that, actually. Nobody is perfect or any other closer to God than anyone else is, in fact. We're all quite capable of having some sort of revelation from God. And I do think that God's actually revealed things to people from all different cultures, different centuries, times, for thousands of years, actually. I don't think it's limited to one group of special people in a special place. I think that people have been inspired to make films, read books, make poems, to make costumes, to make food recipes, to make a whole range of different things in their lives, and to be moved to do whatever they feel is the right thing for them, actually. And I feel like that's just kind of my belief, that God can sort of interact and help inspire people from all different times and places, actually. So I don't think that's a special particular thing that happens to a special person at a special time. So I don't think we should hold a book as being particularly more special, or a person, therefore, because that is the implication behind that. If you hold that book to be more special, then you believe that some people and some things are more special than others, rather than everyone being special and everyone being revealed things to God at different times according to their abilities and different places, actually. And that everyone is also capable of not hearing God, or being selfish, or choosing to do their own things, or having their own plans, or having their own selfish desires. And we're all just as quite capable of that, actually. And I'm certainly not coming with the clouds or anything like that. I think that whole idea of someone coming with the clouds, I think that is sort of somebody who believes that someone is angelic, and someone who lives in heaven that's up in the sky, and someone that's sort of an angelic figure who lives in this ethereal, otherworldly place, who's coming in a sort of like spiritual guise, in this sort of like dream vision state that appear to us in visions, rather than a real flesh and blood person who's actually in a human body, reincarnated, and rather than someone who's grown up in a person in a physical body in a physical world, under the same influences as all the rest of us are. And I think if you wanted to say reincarnation and you wanted to be accurate, you could have just said that, and actually that would have been absolutely accurate and revealed something. And it didn't say that, actually. There's an idea of an angel fluttering down, like with his wings, from a heavenly place above the rest of us, who's looking down on us all. That to me is absurd and ridiculous, and is something, quite rightly, a vision and a dream, and just that actually, but not real. The real sort of person who's flesh and blood, who's got genetic disorders and got problems, just like all the rest of us, and grew up with a family and a society and in a nation and a tribe and a world, actually has their own issues. Not somebody who lived in heaven and was a saint or an angel, but a real person that is just as flawed and corrupt and trying sometimes as anyone else. And I think if you wanted to say that someone was going to return reincarnated, you could have just said that in simple, ordinary language that anyone would understand, that they would be born as a person in another body, because that's fairly simple. If you can get your head around that, it's a very simple thing. It's been understood by Buddhists and Hindus for thousands and thousands of years. If they can understand it, I don't see why the rest of us can't. So he could have just said that and revealed that, couldn't he? But obviously got that point wrong as well. So that's another sort of So I got that point wrong too. So it's sort of like revelation gone wrong, isn't it, really? So like no mention of reincarnation. And yet, of course, the Hindus and Buddhists could have taught them otherwise. And, they've had those beliefs for thousands of years. Turned out to be right in the end on that one. So how people return is in another body, isn't it? So I find that quite interesting, actually, that you're born in one body and you return in a different body, actually. And yes, I suppose ending on that note, that sort of was a kind of like got that totally wrong, I suppose, in that sense. And I suppose it's that sense as well as the idolatry that sort of like has sort of more or less to me proven that it's wrong on several layers. And that doesn't mean there's not other things that potentially have got some validity about it. But I think when something has two major things wrong with it, and I suppose I've known that for quite a long time, but it seems quite fair to share what my genuine thoughts are on that and why I sort of have my disbelief of that, and I suppose if I didn't have disbelief in that, I'd have to disbelief myself and God and other people and my whole life experiences. And I think I'm going to tend to believe those last ones rather than a book, however much pressure or influence there might be. But I make mistakes sometimes, so my beliefs are not infallible either. So I just say, and I just felt it was a good thing to write down what I felt and why I felt it. And also I thought it was good to move on to sort of make a record of why I felt that too, actually. And I suppose it's just a stepping stone towards discussing it, really. And it just helps me to sort of clarify why I feel that, actually. And I suppose it's helpful to sort of look at it and to say why, actually. And so I've also got other books to look at and review as well, as to why I feel things and don't. And I suppose people must come to their own conclusions, but it's important to look at why you come to those conclusions, especially when such serious things can be at stake, when other people's lives and your own soul. I suppose it's on that basis you have to be sort of serious about being honest to other people. If I said wrong information knowingly, I could quite rightly be accused of misleading and distorting and deceiving people, and if I do that about serious issues, it will be on my conscience. Equally, if I don't speak up and say where I think things are wrong or what I feel is right, that equally could be too as well. So I think we all need to bear that in mind, actually. I think that is the case of there's a wrong time to speak. If you say things, especially about serious matters, if you give a wrong sermon, you could actually be deceiving people. And that's quite a serious sort of thing to do, actually, isn't it? If you don't say something you feel in your heart could actually help other people, however, you actually could be neglecting your duties at that time. So I think you have to sort of, that's something you have to bear in mind, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's your salvation of your soul. It's mine that I've got to consider. I've got to answer to God if I sort of wrong other people knowingly, if I don't speak up when I have to, if I give a sermon and knowingly and falsely give wrong information, whatever reason, if I want to appear all knowing, or if I want to, appear as a saviour or helping people, or if I'm too afraid to sort of say something to someone, then it could be on my conscience as well. So I feel like it is a necessary thing to say when you feel called to. And I think that is true for any of us, actually, as well.